The Charles Adler Show starts now.
Starts now. Love those two words. Also love the two words Max Fawcett, not just because I enjoy talking to him. I like calling Uncle Chuck, but because clearly responses are telling us that people who download podcasts really enjoy downloading the wisdom of Max Fawcett. Max, welcome back to the podcast. Good to be back, Uncle Chuck.
So, Max, let me just begin with this business of the homophobia, transphobia, whatever you want to call it, this idea of parental rights. Parents cannot trust teachers with their children, cannot trust teachers to educate their children. This is sounding so similar to my ear to the idea that we cannot trust doctors with COVID. We cannot trust doctors with public health regulations, including vaccines. We can only trust the anti-vaxxer activists. Now, I could be wrong about this, but it just appears that the parental rights folks and the anti-vax folks seem to be the same. I mean, it's just like the same people are steering both clown cars, or is that just my perspective?
No, I think you're 100% right. It's the same carnival. They've just moved on to a different ride. It's the same basic mistrust of government, mistrust of experts, mistrust of educated people. It's that kind of stew of resentment and fear, and it's being applied to a new target. This is sort of, I think, one of the enduring realities of the Freedom Convoy is it's never really gone away, right? It just keeps attaching itself to new causes and new grievances. So it was vaccines, and now it's the LGBTQ community, and goodness knows where it's going to go next. But it's all kind of motivated by the same fear of people who maybe are more educated and more accomplished. I don't know. It's I understand the trepidation that some parents have about this, what feels like an explosion of sort of trans identification among kids, right? I understand the kind of concern that a parent might have, where they think, well, where is this coming from? This wasn't around when I was a kid. All of a sudden it's everywhere. I think part of that is the same thing people said about the gay community a generation ago. Well, there wasn't many gay kids when I went to school. Why are there so many now? It's because they didn't feel comfortable being their true selves. But, part of it is also, I think, in a weird way, there's some power as a teenager that you might have, by going down this road, by kind of throwing your parents for a loop, and you kind of got to let it play out, I think. But these laws, these policies that are being brought forward, I've tried to make this point to a couple of conservatives online. This doesn't apply to you if you're a good parent, right? If you have a good, trusting relationship with your kid, if they talk to you, if they share their fears, their concerns, what's happening at school, then you don't need to rely on the school to tell you that they've changed their pronoun, because they will have told you first. They will have talked it out with you. So, if you're a good parent, if you have a good, open relationship with your kids, don't worry about this stuff. And if you are worried about this stuff, maybe put that effort into improving your relationship with your kids. Like, it's just such a weird thing to be panicked about. But maybe I'm approaching it a bit too rationally here.
I don't know. I do start hearing parents saying things like, I'm worried that Tommy is going to school at 8:30 in the morning, and when I see Tommy at 4:00 in the afternoon, Tommy will think that he's Janie. When I first heard this stuff, I thought, this is absolutely insane. But I can't call it insane in the sense that I can't pretend that sane people aren't involved in this kind of thinking and this kind of fear. Can we just start with biology? Because I tend to choose science over gossip. What does the biology tell us about the percentage of human beings who we think want to transgender?
Oh, goodness. I am speaking well out of school here. I didn't take biology in high school. I was one of those kids who opted for physics and chemistry instead. But, if memory serves, I think it's in the neighborhood of 1% to 2%. It's not a huge number. Maybe it's a bit more, maybe it's more when there's sort of a political kind of opportunity to be rebellious, to be different. Like part of being a kid and being a teenager is creating distance from your parents and the culture that they come from. It's about shocking them and upsetting them and ruffling their feathers, whether that's the music you listen to, or the clothes you wear, or the way you identify. And a lot of that stuff is transitory. It's a stage, it's a process. You play it out and move on to other things. And the worst thing you can do, I think, as a parent is overreact to something like that. But look, for most parents, this is not anything they need to be worried about. And for the ones that are worried, talk to your kids. Have an open relationship with them. The best way to know what's going on in their heads and their lives is to make sure that the space at home is just as welcoming as the space at school. Because if kids feel free to be one way at school and not at home, that's a tell, right? That's an indication that as a parent you have work to do, not that the school has done anything wrong.
So some parents fear that teachers will encourage them to have surgery to transgender. And I have a hard time believing, I mean, I've known a lot of teachers, I've known a lot of principals in my day. I have a hard time believing that any principal would encourage a teacher to go that far. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's almost like satanic panic stuff, where teachers are encouraging kids to I don't know, sacrifice animals at school. Like it's myth, it's legend, it's it's not something that reflects the reality of why people become teachers. People. I know lots of teachers. I don't know a single one of them who is ideological in their approach. They're sort of guiding principles. Number one, they want to do a good job. Number two, they want their kids to succeed and to thrive and to be good citizens. They don't go into schools wanting to apply their particular worldview and shape children in a different way. What I think some people are reacting to is that teachers tend to be more current in their education and their awareness of social trends, and are willing to sort of practice a policy of tolerance. And some people feel very threatened by that, right? They find that scary. They find that a direct sort of challenge to traditional values, traditional worldviews. But that's not ideology. That's just reality. I was having a conversation with someone on Twitter about this, and I was sort of saying, like, your job as a parent and their job as teachers is to prepare kids for the world that exists, not the world that you used to live in or the world that you wish you lived in, but the world that they have to go out into. And yeah, part of that is that there are trans people who exist and we accept them and we support them. That's the world. And if you want to prepare your kids for some 1960s version of the world, then you should probably homeschool them, because that's not what's going to happen in any public, even private school that I know of.
Yeah, you're much kinder than I am. I usually just say to folks, if you turn on the cable guide that most of us have, because most of us still have cable, and you don't see Leave It to Beaver on the guide, it's because Leave It to Beaver left TV a long time ago, and Leave It to Beaver is not returning to TV. It's not returning to the classroom. Let me ask a basic question, though, in terms of what is being taught and not taught, because among all of the fears of what is or isn't going on in schools, there is this fear that math, science, English, French, history, the basics are not being taught, that the entire school curriculum is being dominated and hijacked by these culture wars.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is more space for, tolerant social values, identity-based things than there was in the curriculum 20, 30 years ago. And I think there's a legitimate conversation to be had about whether there needs to be more of a focus on, quote unquote, the basics. I do think that, math education is super important. I think financial literacy is incredibly important for kids to have coming out of high school. I think you can make, and conservatives can make, a very good case around that there needs to be more focus on tangible life skills and less focus on sort of celebrating people's identity. But it's odd that that always ends up focusing on minorities. It always focuses on the LGBTQ community. It always comes back to the same group. And it sort of makes me wonder whether it's not really about the back to basics stuff. It's about they don't want kids being taught that it's okay to be gay, that it's okay to be tolerant of other ways of being. And to me, that's a couple of bridges too far. It's interesting. In Alberta, we had this conversation with the previous government where Jason Kenney brought in this curriculum that was very sort of Leave It to Beaver inspired. It was all about learning about Roman history and Greek history and ancient history, and it was a very classical education, and it did not survive contact with the public, because I think the public understood pretty quickly that this was an attempt to teach people and orient people to a very sort of Western Eurocentric version of the world that we don't live in anymore. I think there are good, interesting conversations to be had about what should be taught in the curriculum, but we are wasting way too much time and energy with this sideshow, around basically outing trans kids that's happening in Saskatchewan, that's happening in Ontario, that happened in New Brunswick. Conservative premiers are seeing that this is an effective wedge issue for them, that parents are sufficiently unaware of the issue or scared of the issue that they can kind of use it to distract them. And to me, that's just unproductive.
So some of these conservative premiers, and I guess the latest would be Doug Ford in Ontario, are seeing pollsters like Angus Reid agree with them. If you look at an Angus Reid poll on the question of should teacher tell the parent or keep it from the parent that Johnny or Janie wants their pronouns changed, Angus Reid says the overwhelming majority of those who want to weigh in on the issue weigh in on the side of what you're calling conservative ideology.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is the way the question is asked. If you ask parents if they want things withheld from them, most people are instinctively just, based on the way it's been framed, going to say, no, I want all the information. I think if you frame that in a different way, you would get a slightly different response. But, public opinion is not always the best guide for these sorts of things. I would submit to you that, a couple of generations ago when corporal punishment, was thought to be a useful parenting technique, if you'd ask parents, do you support corporal punishment? Vast majority of parents would have said, absolutely, I do. And guess what? It turned out to be a really terrible idea. So I'm not sure that you can hide behind a consensus on an issue like this when people are still largely uninformed about what's really going on, and when society is moving in a direction where this could change pretty quickly. It's also interesting to me that premiers like Doug Ford are hiding behind public opinion on this, but on things like climate change, they don't seem nearly as interested in what the public has to say. They aren't guided by that at all. It's very sort of convenient use of that as a political shield. But look, this is what we've seen in the United States: is the Republican Party does not do traditional Republican policies anymore. They don't advocate for lower taxes. They don't advocate for smaller government. They don't advocate for individual responsibility. They use culture wars as a distraction to get their voters, riled up and voting and supporting them. And I think we're seeing conservatives in this country realize that. I saw a story the other day that the conservative convention that's coming up in a short little while is going to have lots of talk about culture war issues around trans issues, around school policy, all these sorts of things that really aren't even Poilievre's bread and butter. It's not the thing that has him ahead by double digits in the polls, but they seem determined to spend their time getting their voters riled up with this culture war stuff rather than bedrock conservative principles.
Is it, just as a practical matter, is it possible they're going to focus on culture wars as opposed to smaller government and lower taxes and climate change and even housing? It's simply because the culture wars business really animates the base in a way that nothing else does.
I think so. I think climate change is one that does animate the base, but not in a way that's helpful for conservatives when they want to win elections. So, Yeah, I think they may use this as fuel to keep their base riled up. I think also the smarter minds in the conservative uh, leader's office, and believe me, they do exist. Understand that the cost of living issue could be off the table by 2025 when we have an election. We know that inflation is coming off the boil. We know that the numbers are trending in the right direction. So, but in 2 years' time, it could be a much less pressing issue. And I think they understand that they need to have something else at the ready to keep people engaged and animated and willing to, open their wallets and volunteer for them, because that is sort of how the Conservative Party and conservative parties are operated now. They have this small group of very intensely loyal, very intensely intense supporters who donate money, volunteer, and they need to keep them constantly in the game.
Max Fawcett, I know that you're spending a good deal of time in your National Observer columns, all of which are must-reads, in my opinion, on the issue of housing, because we have a genuine housing crisis on several levels in this country. We've got a very intelligent new minister of housing, federal housing. This would be Sean Fraser, who's the former immigration minister. Now, the other day, the current immigration minister, Miller, said that, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, because the number just seemed really high, said that this year, 900,000 people in this country are not from this country because they came here recently to study. That is, the universities have brought in 900,000 people from different parts of the world. Does that number seem high?
I thought it was 800,000, but I mean 800,000 or 900,000. It's an insane number. It's crazy, and it's funny because I've been aware of this for over a decade. That post-secondary institutions were kind of told a while back, basically, you're not going to get much more funding from the government. Find your own sources. And they realized that bringing in foreign students to study was a bonanza. You can charge them much more in tuition. They tend to stay in your residences. That there's just a very good revenue stream there. And so, what we saw was just this massive build out of infrastructure and a student body that wasn't from Canada. It through no fault of anyone's. They were simply responding to incentives. But I remember like Capilano College in Vancouver, where my mom used to teach. I had friends go there. It just magically got upgraded to a university. Now, it didn't offer a Bachelor of Arts program. It wasn't really a university. Why did they upgrade it? Because the name university made it more attractive to international students. This the same thing happened in Alberta. It happened in Ontario with Ryerson, here with Mount Royal. It was this sort of reorientation of the entire post-secondary institution universe towards attracting this new stream of applicant. And yeah, that had a big effect on the housing market, because unfortunately they weren't building 900,000 units of housing for all these students, and so they were renting in nearby houses, condos, apartments, what have you, and chewing up the supply that used to be kind of available for other people. And I've been kind of raising the warning flag about this for a while, that the consensus that we have in this country around immigration, that it's good, that it supports economic growth, that we all generally it's a thing that distinguishes us from most countries in the world, certainly the United States. That is not guaranteed. That is not written in stone. And if especially young people start looking at the housing market and realizing that they're paying $3,200 a month for a one bedroom, in part because the federal government is letting so many people into the country to study, they're going to have a response, and it may not be the response that any of us particularly want to see. So, it's interesting that the feds are kind of just getting their heads around this now, when I know people have been warning them about it for quite some time. But yeah, it's a big problem, and I'm not entirely sure how they address this without there being some sort of collateral damage.
Well, this is just what I'll call my common sense political mind. You cannot succeed as a federal liberal without getting the people under the age of 45 voting for you. It's just not possible. So I do not understand why the Liberals would allow a situation like this to fester, one in which the demographic that is most heavily involved and most highly aware is the demographic of people between the ages of 18 and 45 for the most self-evident reasons. They're the ones who are involved in this opportunity. If some people want to, if you're a landlord, I guess it's an opportunity of looking at one bedrooms at $3,200 in this country when you're not really making any money. You're existing on student loans. So I don't understand how a liberal government would look at this metastasizing over the years and not see it as a concerning issue. I mean, how do you square the math?
I mean, part of it is I think willful blindness. I can't remember who said this, but I think it was Paul Wells, but I'm like 90% sure. But there was an anecdote about a senior public servant who in the federal government who expressed shock that the foreign student program, the visas that they were giving students to come study here were really being used and being marketed by universities as a very short path to landed resident status and a path to living in Canada, even though the universities were marketing in this way. They go to other parts of the world and say, hey, if you want to live in Canada, come study at our university for 2 or 3 years, and that gets you on the short path to becoming a landed resident, and then you can get your citizenship. So it's not like people weren't flagging this for them, but it seems like government officials and then trickling up to the political side either didn't believe it or didn't think it was a priority. It really is not a good look, and they are paying a very high price for it right now. If you look at some of the polls lately, the Abacus data poll had the Liberals in third place, not second place, third place among Canadians under the age of, I think, 45 or 44.
Yeah, Canadians. I mean, we're talking millennials. I mean, it's. I think it's catechism in politics that if you're a left of center party and you can't get millennials, you're out of business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they, I would say one of the hallmarks of this government is they're good on the big issues. They're good on COVID. They're good on climate change. They get the big things right, but when it gets into the details, especially the economic details, they lose focus. And I think they lost focus of how bad housing was when they took government. I mean, it wasn't, Poilievre, keeps trying to pretend like housing was tickety-boo when the Conservatives were in power. Living in Vancouver and Toronto, it was not good. Housing was very expensive, but it has gotten so much worse, especially in the last little while, especially in the rental market, that it has reached, genuine crisis proportions now. And they took their eye off the ball the whole time. They didn't take it seriously. They had a housing minister before Sean Fraser who, not only owned his own rental properties, but, wrote an op-ed like basically weeks ago saying that, we shouldn't blame the municipalities. It's not their fault. Like, just no sense of. He wrote in that op-ed, I remember that, this is a crisis that affects hundreds of thousands of Canadians. Wrong. It affects millions of Canadians, possibly tens of millions of Canadians. So they just didn't get it. And as I've said, as I've written, if Poilievre can stay away from the culture war stuff and the vaccine stuff, and clearly he can't, but if he can find a way to distract himself long enough to just focus on housing, the next election is his. It's his in a cakewalk at this point.
Yeah, some things are really just about the math. There's no ideology here. So I'm looking at the math. If somewhere between 800 and 900,000 students are being accepted as foreign students, and they clearly need food and shelter, okay, and you've got 500,000 people being brought in as regular immigrants, that's almost 1.5 million new Canadians. This is a country of 40 million people. I don't think anybody believes that we've got housing that can accommodate that number. And if we don't, it means that house prices, which have been accelerating, are going to continue to do precisely that. Politically, that's toxic for the government.
Absolutely. And the fact that and again, yes, that there is, provincial aspect to this issue because, education and housing is largely a provincial issue, but the federal government is the one that is allowing this number of people to come in. So they have to have their eye on the ball and have a commitment or some sort of guarantee that for each student that is brought into this country, there is an additional unit of housing, student housing, that is being built or maintained for them. And they did not do that. The other part of that number, that the 800,000 or 900,000, it's not distributed equally, right? It's all in, where the post-secondary institutions are. So Greater Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Greater Toronto area, Greater Montreal area. It is very heavily concentrated, and heavily concentrated in the markets that are already overheated. So, it's almost like if you wanted to create a housing crisis, this would be one very good way to do it.
Well, look, it's not just students. Let's just go to immigration. Max, I don't care where an immigrant to Canada lands in Canada. I know where the immigrant lands eventually. I mean, they may come to St. John, New Brunswick, in 2023, but there's a very distinct possibility that by 2027 or 2029, they're in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal. That's the way things flow in most countries. In most countries, people end up going to the major metropolitan areas. Now, those are also the places that just happen to be the foundational experiences for Liberal success. If Liberals don't succeed in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, once again, they're out of business. That's why so much of this, to me, appears to be a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a no-brainer to me too. It's kind of baffling that it isn't a no-brainer to the Liberal Party. I think, to some extent, they take their success in those places for granted. In the same way that Conservatives, quite rightly, take their success in the prairies for granted. But things can change. I reminded of the '93 election where I grew up believing that there would always be two, basically the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives, and the NDP would be kind of in the mix. And all of a sudden, the Progressive Conservative Party just vanished. So things can change in politics very quickly. And do the Liberals have enough time to undo some of this damage? They're not going to fix the housing market in 2 years. That's for sure. What they can do, as I've written about this, they can move mountains in the same way that they did during COVID and show people that they take it seriously. And then the battle becomes, who do they trust more? Do they trust Poilievre and his promises, or do they trust Trudeau and his promises? And I think they have a better shot there. But right now, what they've been serving up to people, especially young people in cities, is a government that has been in power while the situation got noticeably worse and rhetorically doesn't seem to care, and a Conservative leader who maybe they don't trust, maybe they don't like, but rhetorically, he gets it. He talks about it in the same way and with the same passion that young people do right now, right? And at the very least, the Liberals have to find a way to show young people that this is at the top of their list, not fifth, not seventh, but number one.
Max, I need to ask you something that I don't expect a yes or no answer on, but I think it's worthy of discussion as things move forward and we look at these numbers. In a liberal democracy called Canada, should we at some point accept the notion that there is a universal right, universally, to access to affordable housing? A universal right to access affordable housing. Is that what tomorrow's Canada is all about?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I struggle with that. I struggle with that on a number of levels, not least because I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, but it feels like it would be hard to enforce that right. It feels like where you get into sort of definitional issues of affordability, things could get very kind of tricky. But I think Canadians have the right to enforce a political consensus, just as they do around healthcare, that access to affordable housing is something that must exist, and if it doesn't exist, we will change the government to one that will give it to us. But I think, and I'm working on something about this that I don't know, next couple of weeks I'll write about it. But the problem with the way we're talking about housing right now is it still isn't an honest conversation. We're still talking about it like the government can magically cut house prices in half without hurting people, right? Polyev says, well, I'll get rid of gatekeepers and bring home more housing, and that'll fix the problem. How is that going to fix the problem? If the only way that fixes the problem is if it meaningfully reduces house prices, and that wipes out a whole generation of people who bought over the last few years. Ironically, it hurts young people much more than it hurts, older Canadians who have paid their houses off or who, have very small mortgages now. So there are always going to be trade-offs in this conversation. I think we have to get past this simplistic, like, well, we'll just let the market build more housing and everything will be better, to how do we build the right kinds of housing that take pressure off in the places where we have the most pressure, and how do we actually create real affordability? So there was a report that was released recently from a group of developers and housing experts, including a guy named Mike Moffat, who's sort of everywhere in this conversation right now, and it really focused on seniors housing, student housing, and co-op housing. The government can play a role in building and maintaining affordability in those places. I think that's a really good place to start. Like I grew up in a co-op in Vancouver. My mom, did not have any equity to give to me, but she also was able to raise me in a place where, things were affordable. We lived in a good neighborhood. We had great neighbors. And that model works. That model was abandoned by the federal government. It was abandoned first by Mulroney's progressive conservatives and then by the Chrétien Martin liberals. It would be nice to see the federal government get back into that game in a big way. That's one way that they can guarantee a certain level of affordability for those most at the margins. The other way is to focus on the rental market. Not everyone needs to own a house. This is not a controversial position in Europe, in lots of parts of the world. This sort of obsession with home ownership is very much a North American thing. And we would do well, I think, to focus a lot of these affordability measures on creating units of supply where you have secure tenure, you can't be evicted, you can't be booted out, you can't, have your rent jacked up on you. And then if you want to buy, you can build on that foundation. But right now the rental market is more treacherous than the housing market. And I think that's what has a lot of people really panicked, because that was always, that's the place where people are most at risk, most at jeopardy. And if they're seeing their rents go up $200-$300 a year, that's really hard to come back from.
Well, the city that you live in, Max, in Vancouver, rents are now up 14.5% year after year. 14.5%. I mean, who can sustain it? Who can afford it? Let me go to something else that's it's economics, but once again, math matters. One can't just obsess about culture wars. There's always this talk about how the market can figure this out and the market can figure that out. There's no reason why the federal government cannot create its own market. You talk about co-op housing and the co-op housing that you were brought up in. That housing was not part of the so-called free market. That was a separate market created by the government. Just like when the government after World War II needed housing for its veterans. They created a separate market. It wasn't the kind of market where a person could own something, own where they lived, and then sell it for a profit. That's not socialism. That's just giving people, I guess, what we would call in Canada, a social safety net. Once again, access to affordable housing. There's no reason why you can't create a market like that for people who are without means. That is the homeless and those people who have very, very modest means. There's no reason why you can't create a market like that for students. No reason why you can't create a market like that for seniors. I mean, the stuff that Moffat is talking about, the reason he's all over the place is he makes sense.
Exactly. I mean, he has done his homework. He understands this issue and knows where the leverage points are for the federal government. I mean, the free market fundamentalists will always reject the government getting involved in these sorts of things. But I think in a way that's a really interesting opportunity for the Trudeau Liberals to kind of get back in this ballgame, is to really go big on social housing, government housing, in those specific areas that Moffat mentions, and really kind of force Poilievre to make his case, because I suspect he will oppose those things. He will oppose building more co-ops, more social housing, more student housing, more senior housing, because he sees only one solution to this, as he does to many things, which is the market. And that's an interesting conversation. If it, not one politician who cares about it versus a government that doesn't seem to, but one party that thinks the market is the solution versus one party that thinks that the government has a role to play here. No guarantees that the Liberals are able to win on this issue, or even kind of get back into a reasonable sort of draw with the Conservatives on it. But I think it's their best hope of getting back in the game, and that's clearly what they need. They need to give young people at the margins, some hope that this situation is going to get better, because it has consistently gotten worse for the last 15 years, and it really wears on you. I know lots of people in Vancouver and Toronto play in those markets where, they've been waiting for a correction, waiting to, they didn't want to spend all their money and get totally leveraged just to buy a, teardown. And they kind of feel like they've watched their lives pass them by. It's really frustrating, especially when, you had older generations kind of maybe in your ear about, oh, you should buy, it's always the best decision. It was much easier for them to buy a generation or two ago than it is today. But it really can consume a lot of your energy and your attention. And honestly, people shouldn't have to spend this much time thinking about housing. They have other things to focus on: their kids, their careers, their passions, their travel, whatever it might be. People don't live, and they shouldn't have their lives revolve around shelter. And I think that's one thing that the government could really help with, is create a basic sort of benchmark of stability of shelter, stability of tenure, and then let people get on with their lives. Because this is great for developers, this is great for landlords, it's great for real estate speculators. But why in the world are we revolving, orienting our economy and our society around their interests? Madness.
The price of food and the price of shelter, is that the reason the Liberals are paying a horrible political price, according to the latest polling? If the price of food and the price of shelter were no longer controversial issues, would the Liberals be head to head with the Conservatives right now? Would they be ahead of them? How much are these issues actually supporting the Conservatives, regardless of where they may be on culture wars?
I think it would be a lot closer. The cost of living stuff is, it feels like you're, that frog that's being boiled in a pot of water, right? I notice it every time I go to the grocery store. I pick something up and I'm like, has pasta always been $3.99 a package? I don't remember it being that expensive. Like it wears on you. And it's sort of this almost daily, or, every time you go to the grocery store, it's a grind. Even if your salary is you're getting a raise, like so many people are right now, it just doesn't feel like it's keeping up. And so it really, I think, orients people to being open to a different political choice. I think that the job that the Liberals need to be doing, and they're absolutely awful at this right now, is just trying to highlight what the other choice would mean. Because there's nothing that Poilievre is saying or proposing that would change the price of pasta at the grocery store. Getting rid of the carbon tax is the king of nothing burgers on this issue. I think, it's been studied many, many times, despite what the quote unquote food professor likes to say on Twitter. And the carbon tax, I think, has an impact of about 0.5% on food prices. So, you'll notice that food inflation is a huge issue in the United States. They don't have a carbon tax. So it's not the carbon tax. Getting rid of the carbon tax isn't going to do anything for that. And guess what? The rebate, which again, the Liberals have not communicated well, but the rebate actually benefits the lowest income Canadians. The 20% poorest and the 20% above them are net beneficiaries, even when you include the modeled economic impact. So if you're trying to help people at the bottom of the ladder, getting rid of the carbon tax and the rebate is probably one of the dumber things you can do. So they need to do a better job of explaining, here's what we're doing about this cost of living issue, but here's what the other guys are proposing. because right now it really, again, feels like one side is proposing to do something and the other side is not really doing enough. And in that situation, I think voters will naturally gravitate towards the alternative.
So don't ask me why, but the other day I was in the mood for grapes and happened to be at Walmart. And so a box of grapes, I think it was 3 pounds. It wasn't very large, 3 pounds. But the number was $8.50. And I thought to myself, no wonder the Liberals are in trouble. $8.50 for a few grapes?
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy, Max. It's crazy.
Yep. Yeah, I think they slept on this food inflation issue, and maybe I'm guilty of this sometimes, but pointing out that there's food price inflation in other parts of the world doesn't help you, right? It doesn't feed your family. It doesn't make your bill smaller. It is a kind of cold comfort to people who are really stressed out by this stuff. And I think they could have gotten in the game a little earlier. Maybe with some direct supports. I understand that the economists would have hated that because that, of course, feeds inflation. But I think as a government, and this is a lesson I think that this government has not learned particularly well, economists don't always have your best interests at heart. And economists are not exactly notorious for being good communicators with the public. And so, you look at things like the carbon tax and some of their policies, they're a big hit with economists. Economists are less than 1% of the population. They might even be less than 0.1% of the population. And you need to orient your policies in a way that regular people can understand and appreciate. It's why, the approach to climate change that the Americans are using is I think way more popular and way more durable, because people don't see it every time they fill up or every time they go to the grocery store. They just go, well, the government's spending some money somewhere on incentives for industrial projects, and I guess that's a good thing. It doesn't bother me. They don't see the cost showing up on their tax bill. But every time you go to the gas station in Canada, every time you go to the grocery store, it's broken out right there on your bill for the gas station. And it's just a reminder that the government has their thumb on this particular scale. And a lot of people don't like it. And, look, I wish we lived in a society where everyone had, a foundational understanding of economics, but we very clearly don't. And you got to play the hand you're dealt.
Max Fawcett, give me just a preview of your next column in the National Observer, and then I'll let you go.
I'm going to be writing. I wrote today about a lady named Sheila Lewis, who was she had a terminal illness, needed an organ transplant, and refused to get it because of the COVID-19 vaccine. She weirdly got all of her other vaccines, but then refused to get this one vaccine, and of course, the hospital wouldn't give it to her because they have perfectly good reasons to prioritize people who have all their vaccinations. It's become a big culture war thing with the anti-vax community, and I just sort of wrote about what that means for this sort of ongoing conservative war on expertise, and the fact that Pierre Poilievre and his new candidate in York Centre in Toronto are treating this woman like a martyr. It does not bode well for a fact-based and reality-based conversation. And then the next column after that will be about what I feel is sort of a building attempt to undermine our courts. There's been a couple of pieces in the National Post about how judges they're biased towards liberal donors, and the actual facts of the case are very thin gruel, but it's being sort of played up like this argument, or it's supporting this argument that our courts are biased, that they're politicized. What I think is really happening is that conservatives want our courts to be politicized. I can't even tell you the number of conservatives who have DM'd me saying, well, one of Stephen Harper's biggest failures is he didn't politicize the courts enough. Imagine that. But that will be a key part of Poilievre's agenda if he becomes prime minister, is making our court system more overtly political, more like the American one. I think that's disastrous. And so I'm going to write about it.
Max Fawcett writes for the National Observer. Unfortunately, we're having him on this show from time to time, and he is among our most popular when it comes to download. So you're welcome in advance. I'll say you're welcome for the thank you you're about to offer for the Max Fawcett conversation. Max Fawcett is in Calgary. I just want to thank everyone who tunes into these podcasts and tells their their friends and neighbors. Remember to either follow or like or subscribe. Either action, it doesn't matter to me. It's just the way that we grow this baby. And I thank you very much for participating in that growth. I'm Charles Antler.
Catch Charles Adler Mondays on Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson. Twice a week in the Winnipeg Free Press. And every day at criermedia.co.